When I first heard the title of the book, Bronze Age Mindset, I was under the impression, and I presume a lot of people who picked up this book were too, prior to getting further into it, that the Bronze Age mindset, this mentality which worshipped the Bronze Age as the best historical and cultural era in human existence, was being used as a negative, an insult by the author. The idea that a bunch of primitive, tribalistic barbarians would somehow possibly be something to aspire to, it took me as off, never imagining someone would advocate a return to such a time, to such behaviors. The Bronze Age mindset, I thought, was what many people buy into today, that certain people behave foolishly, hedonistically, and without dignity. Misogynists, male tribalists, just gorillas banging on drums, absent of intellectual ability, absent of critical thought. And looking back on it, I think this says a lot about me, a lot more than it says about the author, because I came in with this impression that the Bronze Age was the worst of all ages, that it needed to be replaced with an ethical civilization which respected reason and science. Now, of course, as you can tell by the description I've given of my own politics, I'm not quite convinced that returning to the spirit of the Bronze Age, as the author wants, is the best path for humanity to walk. But, simultaneously, I do crave tradition, culture, and identity, all things incredibly pronounced during the olden days, a few decades ago, but really most prominent prior to the Enlightenment across Europe. So, before anything else is said about Bronze Age mindset, the period of the Bronze Age, which spanned 6200 BC to 400 BC, according to the introduction and abandonment of bronze materials, is not used as a negative. In fact, the whole point of the book, what the author, Bronze Age Pervert, argues, is that we need to return to a time, this time, the Bronze Age. By means of the human spirit, we need to adopt the lifestyles, mindsets, and energy which subsisted during such an historical era. The various peoples spread across the West, who built incredible civilizations, they're the type of people we should aspire to be. So, who is the author, the Bronze Pervert? Well, from the description given of himself, both in the book and on the internet, he's a masculine bodybuilder, a strong man filled with passion and vigor, who loves his exercise, his workouts, his time spent writing. While reading the book, I often imagined him as writing this text in flaming bursts, a vitality pumping through his veins as he typed, where he slipped in and out of working out, strengthening his body, freeing his mind from the prison that weak, decadent liberalism has manufactured. Based on what he's written of himself, he believes in healthy social relations between oneself, including myself, and other people, but finds most social situations one finds themselves in, with strangers or new romantic interests, to be incredibly uncomfortable, because the vast majority of humanity has been engulfed with the wrong soul, an energy which doesn't resonate with the likes of ancient Athenian heroes, but instead materialistic consumerism. You know the Chad meme, greatest meme ever made. Well, the Bronze Pervert is essentially Chad, the type of guy who impresses all the ladies, earns respect from all fellow masculine men, and doesn't waste his time with hedonistic consumption, but instead concentrates his efforts and sights to improve in himself, physically, spiritually, and emotionally, to conquer the undesirable inner workings of his mind, to escape the cultural trap created by centuries of Enlightenment indoctrination. There's this joke I've heard, a theory, that the Bronze Pervert is, in actuality, a short, hook-nosed Jewish college student who identifies as a third-wave feminist and wrote the book as an experiment in their studies on the far right. Very unlikely. Nonetheless funny to think about. The bronze variant of men, the proud, dignified, handsome, monogamous, and vigorous men who really, rarely ever exist within the West nowadays. That's the category of men the bronze perverts are part of. In the grand scheme of things, they're the rarity, these sorts of men. Even I, who believes in the necessity of traditional gender roles, doesn't fall into this category, even of those who identify as part of the alternative or dissident right. Most of you aren't this kind. We're talking about men who regularly work out, who are married, who have children, who raise their children in safe, white, homogeneous environments with the traditional cultural customs and tendencies of their ancestors, of their once prideful people. With the swarms of diversity and multiculturalism forced upon humanity in the present day, very few of you actually live the way the bronze pervert presumably does. And his brand of men. Likewise for women, the traditionalist feminine woman who cares about beauty, honor, being a great mother, and the arts. Well, she's almost non-existent as well. In the contemporary Western world, no matter the success in building identitarian and nationalist movements, men are searching desperately for feminine women. Few who are genuinely feminine, which exist now, all crafted by a misguided political environment to behave like the opposite sex. And for women who organically seek masculine men, likewise, few exist, and the ones who do are usually complete dicks. Now, since we've identified the one type of men, the kind far more prevalent within the Bronze Age than today, what are the rest? Prior to getting to the other type, the extreme reverse of masculinity and dignity, of self-control and rationality, I'd like to point out the most men today, including those who identify as far-right, as I've said, as fascists or national socialists or whatever, are in between the two extremes. Myself and the majority of you are men searching for a purpose, to make life meaningful. Our relationships to fellow men, and by extension, women, or alternatively phrased, absence of such relationships, they're based in wanting to be a part of a larger scene, to enter into a spiritual collective in order to distance ourselves from a collapsing civilization that cares not for its cooperative groups. Many philosophies advance this sentiment of collectivism. For example, the political religion of fascism seeks to place the individual at the center of the universe, the heart that connects all events in history, all philosophy, ontology, and elevates them to a state of shared consciousness, where they're able to become part of a holistic, organized spiritual society, transcending the limits of the mortal coil, of the falseness of individualistic autonomy, and merge themselves into a corporate body, an association, organization, platform that represents and expresses their interests, spirits, and character, so they can join hand in hand with their fellow companions. A romantic membership which grants one permission to subsist in conditions of expanded insight, conceptually constructing their own destiny, granted by means of existence, an objective will to which they are subject to a higher law, introduced and reinforced by their spiritual collective, where there exists no singular person, instead a passionate and heroic people. During the Bronze Age, and really all of history prior to the Enlightenment and its offspring, the French Revolution, human beings have always traveled in packs, feeling wholly connected to their social groups. It was always tribes which represented the heart and soul, the flesh and blood of all desired connections, of civil associations. Now, because it makes sense to categorize people into groups, because that's what we've always done, and it's most efficient, we have to now discuss the opposite of the Chad, the masculine warrior type, the class of the ancient world. Who am I referring to? Well, the bronze pervert refers to these sort of men as bug men, likely due to their unattractiveness, both in terms of physical and emotional repulsiveness. These are the kinds of people, usually single, white, middle-class hedonists, who spend all their free time doing apolitical things, such as watching films, playing video games, or reading science fiction or fantasy literature, which on its own is okay, but they don't appear to have any higher meaning to their lives. They don't seem to strive for anything larger, to be part of a community, or to contribute to society positively. Instead, they're focused on absorption, of consumption for the sake of consumption. As a product of late-stage capitalism, the private owners of industry who pump out endless film sequels, who recreate the same brand and property over and over again, benefit greatly from the mindless indulgence created by, objectively, the least dignified section of the proletariat.
It's an instinct. Feeling. The force brought us together. We're not alone.
Is that Yavin?
Good people will fight if we lead them.
Ah, yes!
People keep telling me they know me.
Oh
No
my
one does.
god.
But I do.
Ooh.
The truth is that bugmen aren't spending their lives productively. They don't seek to accomplish anything, to make themselves honorable, dignified, masculine. Unlike the men of old, the bugmen are the antithesis of the Bronze Age mindset. The very fabric of a miserable, heartless world, consuming day after day without any change, alteration from the established pattern. It never leads to activism, to political movement, to revolution. It permits people to stay in the same conditions as they are now, to never advance the good of all people. What hedonism is, just like pacifism, is a justification for things to remain the same, no matter what, always unyielding. The organized worker, the syndicalist, the revolutionary nationalist, the climate change activist, well, you get the idea. All individuals as well as groups who seek to better their planet. The capitalist state has manufactured political cultures and environments that foster the opposite of creativity. Instead, they foster conformity, a homogeny amongst all people, not based in a racial, religious, or personality-oriented nature, but in ignorance of their enslavement. Not just their enslavement to the state, but their enslavement to themselves. Their bodies don't act in accordance with their minds. They want to do one thing, but their physical figure does another. They want to break free to create a meaningful lifestyle, but they find themselves not as they are now, which is frequently depressed, anxious, and devoid of any real future. But they can't, and they know they can't. The bugman is just a stereotypical nerd with somewhat left-leaning political views who will never be anything more than what they currently are. So, the bronze spirit animates those willing to comply, to become something more, in fashioning them into the ancient Spartans of Greece. In Bronze Age mindset, the bronze pervert talks about the past a lot. Well, I mean, of course he does. He's a reactionary or traditionalist or whatever. In doing so, he draws out the distinctions between modern men, including bugmen, and men of the ancient world, prior to the birth of Christianity. In ancient Greece, for example, which he cites as a case of a pre-modernist society having strong, respectable men, the warriors of a state weren't anything like the conscripted men who fought against Marxist-Leninist governments across continents, or the modern military complex. The structures who are occupied by hundreds of thousands of Western soldiers. The great Greek Romans, aside from being physically fit and ready for action, saw war as a romantic expression of their nation's conquest over others, whether these be different countries or indigenous populations. They were always on their toes in battle, and suffered no trauma having killed their opponents. This is not because they were devoid of emotion. Quite the contrary. They were filled to the brim with emotion. The contemporary world, with its capitalist liberalism and hatred for ancestral and cultural homogeny, for any sort of effective unification, has desensitized people to immorality, to suffering, to the pain of one's fellow man and woman. It has, in effect, produced the most soulless of economic and social conditions, of landscapes, of climates. The emotions of the ancient Greek Spartans, in their fights against fellow tribes and empires, were fierce, actualized, without compromise. It was a sense of rage, yet a controlled one. The units who functioned together harmoniously in armies, their strength and might combined, were able to overwhelm opposing legions, cutting heads and necks with swords fashioned from bronze copper, and spilling the guts and blood of their enemies with a gleeful zeal. Every person they killed, they collectively saw themselves as furthering and advancing the vigor and goals of their civilization, their precious homeland. With or without conscription, it was still impressive in its own, because even those forced into war still managed to make of it the best they could, to interpret it as their own internal struggle, to overcome the foreign menaces outside their national sphere. They usually had loving wives they could return to, and traditional family structures, which represented their dedication not merely to themselves, but to a corporate body which they drew their energy and passion from. What the Bronze Pervert often talks about is this idea within Greek and Roman mythology and legends that centers around action, constant, uncompromising movement on the part of men who involve themselves frequently with the events and news of their nation, their racial bulk, and cultural climate. Man was a soldier, a warrior, a chef, an architect, someone who was critical of all that they saw, everything which entered into the orbit of their mind. They didn't seek to satisfy their urges through mere consumerism, instead the bettering of their community. They understood that any injustice done to them must, realistically, be applied to all other, or many other, members of their community, the wider society around them, as opposed to being passive, a negative consequence of the hedonism and pacifism of the bugmen, the misguided sheep who flock around popular culture including Star Wars to provide them with an identity, as opposed to forging one based upon a shared sense of history, through the blood of their people, not horny young adults who whip out their dicks to hot hentai. They're not the correct people, but to the worshippers and critics of fine art. The warrior class of the past, of Greece and Rome, was aggressive, on the move, conquering entire cities and countries with their blade, slicing away and leaving such landscapes behind in a blaze, flames engulfing the fallen structures across the European continent. War that used to be ruled by kings and queens, where the subjects of such monarchical orders were proud to serve their fatherland, and, if given the choice, would sacrifice themselves for a higher good and a high-up god, have you denounced what would now be identified as liberalistic individualism, now fall into the degeneracy of evil Jewish bourgeois despotism. The Bronze Age Pervert contrasts these attitudes and ideological, behavioral tendencies side by side, conflicting entirely, and points to man's sad decline over the centuries. Nowadays, what's considered brave by mass society, in contrast to the heroism of war or nationhood, it's standing up for minorities who already hold a monopoly on victimization status, on the back and forth, never-ending idea of their oppression being ongoing, to the exclusion of all other groups' hardships, including the European race, who are forced to listen to how horrible their own kind is within compulsory education. The men of the past were driven by honor, true bravery, to fight for their collective. The men of today, however, are driven by selfishness, true laziness, to set aside their own individual tastes, true material consumption, devoid of any higher purpose. The men of the past cared about physical fitness, maintaining health, and being able to protect their loved ones from invading foreign barbarians. The men of today buy into the belief that diversity is a universal strength, that the hordes of immigrants are just cultural enrichment and any society needs them in order to be progressive. They don't care to have a family. They couldn't possibly live with anyone, let alone a woman, unless that person shared all their tastes and opinions in regards to pop culture and entertainment, which within itself has been informed through mass media and not through any unique means. The men of the past cared to stylize their living spaces, to live pluralistically and rurally, surrounded by their own tribe, their wife and children, and warmly embraced traditionalist, cultured architecture. The men of today, unfortunately, live in metropolitan, hideous cityscapes, the most ugly and disgusting places on earth. Modernist architecture, in comparison to traditionalist design, is an absolute plague. It has no soul, no justification. Pretentious, dull, and repetitive. It represents everything wrong with our political cultures today, for it shows the sheer emptiness of a geographical people. Unlike countries such as China, Japan, Iran, and India, with their own interesting and attractive architectural innovations, modernism has tainted Western development of living spaces, inhabiting territories packed intensely overpopulated, with crowds bumping into one another. When anyone attempts to go for a walk, made far worse than trying to ride public transportation, despite being surrounded by many people, none of which have any personal connection to each other. Thus is a hollow, empty set of cities, that which modernism has created and sustains. Something the author of Bronze Age Mindset points out, much to the reader's surprise, is that you, the reader of their book, despite thinking that you're above the bugmen, the demasculized, decadent, pitiful cockroaches who crawl the ground for burnt crumbs, who aren't defined through their uniqueness, but instead by what media they consume, existing as nothing more than a mouth to devour the products of neoliberalism. You are, in fact, fake and gay. Not the absolute fakest and gayest of all, like the bugmen, but nonetheless, someone who seriously needs to improve themselves in order to liberate themselves from modernism's faggotry. In other words, nowhere near the level of perfection that a bronze warrior, a true Chad, has achieved. Their very existence, subsisting as a gem in a sea of weaklings, replicates the folklore, mythology, and spirit of their ancestors. They're not machines who exist to fulfill predetermined tasks set in stone by their developers. However, at the same time, they're not quite born free. Initially in chains, they work to gain their freedom, resisting what has been cast upon them, refusing to follow the trends of a morally corrupt, spiritually weak social order. Unlike the bugmen and liberal academics who gave in to the status quo, someone who truly carries the bronze spirit upon their shoulders doesn't conform to normality. Instead revives that which dwelled in the past. They're not born a Spartan, of course. It is through labor, energy, and sweat, a lot of blood and tears, that a regular individual can become a true man. The brilliant, genius model for what was being developed in fascist Italy a long time ago. In fascism, there was this concept known as the new man. With the development of the fascist spirit, Italy would enter into an era when nothing would ever be the same as prior. The people, transformed by the new political, economic, and nationalistic ethics of the corporate estate, find themselves as different than before, discover a much more vitalic, happy, and energetic version of themselves hidden all along. It was through fascism that new men were made, that the materialist, cosmopolitan, and individualistic elements of the old liberal state were able to vanish. It was through revolutionary nationalism, where the nation and the state are spiritual constructions of the collective consciousness of all its citizens, that a new world was able to be in the people's minds, in their souls. In order to become a Spartan, you, the reader, must not merely adopt the Bronze Age mindset and spirit, but, in your radical transformation, fulfill the actions necessary to be a Spartan. You need discipline, physical fitness, a solid environment for learning, and, most importantly, to read more theory. Read more theory. So, that's Bronze Age Mindset by Bronze Age Pervert. It was a very enjoyable read. By fact of its abstract essence, I was expecting it to have a needlessly complicated writing style. However, I was surprised by the way it was written. The Bronze Pervert does a really good job at conveying what he thinks, feels, and wishes to compare historically. In many ways, many obvious ways, it reminds me a lot of Might Makes Right, especially in regards to the type of person the author is. Very much recommend buying this book. It was a solid read all the way through.
Yes.